Good to see each one here this evening. We want you to feel welcome and remember the question period that will be coming in a few moments. We have some people that are a little bit shy answering questions and sometimes have a hard time getting them started and then have a hard time getting them stopped sometimes. Let's keep that in mind as we proceed. The evolutionists tell us that the progressive development of life that is recorded in the rocks, so that when we dig down in the rocks, we find in the upper levels the more complex organisms, and the further down you go, the simpler they get. And this record of the evolution of life is used as one of the strongest arguments for evolution. And if it is as often represented, usually represented, certainly in undergraduate work, it would appear to be a very persuasive argument. There's some very serious problems with that. Representation of what we're supposed to find when you dig down in the earth. Again, the more complex animals at the top, the less complex animals at the bottom, the deeper you go. The biggest problem with this is that you can't dig down in the earth and find it anywhere. And that's a pretty good sized problem. Certainly not in its complete form. This is pieced together. Now that's news to a lot of people who've seen it many, many times. What do you mean we can't find it? It's in my biology textbook. It's in my life science textbook. It's in all of them, but just not in the earth. Notice the statement from Leet and Judson, which is a standard geology textbook. Because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all of Earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. Some of it's over here, some of it's over there, and so they stack it together. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation. And so it's correlated by stacking it together. Now, how do they know how to do that? How do you know what goes on top and what goes on bottom? Well, if you're an evolutionist, what would go on bottom? The simplest forms. And the more complex on top. That's the way you stack it. And when you get it stacked, then what have you proved? I think we can see the obvious problem here. But let's understand first that it's not something concrete, if you'll pardon the pun, that you find when you dig down in the earth. As we read in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the end product of correlation is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. Now, they don't tell you it's a mental abstraction generally in your textbooks, do they? They say, this is what you find. Now, this is the mental abstraction that is the result of piecing it together. R.H. Rastell of Cambridge University, writing in the Encyclopedia Britannica, describes the process and how it works. He says, it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. Now, to somewhat oversimplify, but illustrate what they're talking about, a person says, all right, we've got a primitive fossil here. Okay, primitive fossil. How do you know that's a primitive fossil? Well, because it's found in an old rock. Okay, I understand that. You have an old rock, it's got a primitive fossil in it. But now how do you know this is an old rock? Well, it's got a primitive fossil in it, you see. This is the circular process, again somewhat overemphasized, but basically what we find happening. This is the result of correlation. It is a mental abstraction, and it is skewed toward the evolutionary picture first by the fact, well not first, but I'll say second now, by the fact that these big vertebrates that you see that are very impressive, that are typically represented, are not, well, they're there, but in such minuscule percentages that this representation is very skewed. Most of what you find, well, as one geologist says, it's clams, and more clams. It's marine invertebrates. It's shells. That's by far the majority. only 0.0125% of all the fossils we find are vertebrates. And yet when you look at the geologic column, that's most of what you see in it. Certainly doesn't represent this percentage. 95% are marine invertebrates. But that's not the way it's represented. If it were represented as virtually all marine invertebrates, then you might get the impression this is a marine deposit. Wouldn't you? Well, they don't want to leave that impression. Of course, that was the conclusion of all the founders of the discipline of geology, that this was the result of the catastrophic flood that we read about in Scripture, that this year-long series of catastrophes buried the world that then was, laid down the sediments, average of about 1.5 miles, covering the continents with billions and billions of dead things in it, so that the majority of what we see is a marine deposit. Nicholas Steno, who is one of the heroes, presented as such in all of the geology textbooks today, called the father of modern stratigraphy, the study of the strata, is one who is touted as really understanding and explaining what we know about stratigraphy. Here from Evolution of the Earth by Dott and Batten, a standard geology textbook, we read, besides correctly interpreting fossils, Steno drew some even more important conclusions about the strata in which they occur. The result was formulation of the basic principles, the most basic principles for analysis of Earth history. Steno showed great insight. And this is the hero. This is the one who really figured it all out and wrote it down so we could understand it. Steno's axioms, these 12 principles of interpreting the strata that you have to memorize, and if you don't know it, you're not going to pass stratigraphy, provide the ultimate basis of practically all interpretation of Earth history. Now, this is the way you do stratigraphy. And if you don't know it, you just can't do it. This is it. So their importance can hardly be overemphasized. Now, what they don't tell you is that Steno believed all of it was done in this year-long series of catastrophes in the flood that we see in the Bible. When I was doing work at Cambridge in England, they had one of the original editions of his book, Under Glass, there in the Trinity Library. The fly page says this is dedicated to the proof of the Noachian deluge. Now that tells you where this hero of geology comes from. And people will say, well, this is a crazy idea. It doesn't fit what we know about geology. Well, it provided him the understanding to be able to write the rules that everybody still uses today and hasn't really improved upon. The basis of practically all interpretation of Earth history. It evidently worked pretty well. I think it works very well. This is, of course, the competing idea. And our procedure, as we pointed out earlier this week, is to compare the two models. Steno's view, and of course the understanding that we've gained in the years intervening, as opposed to the evolutionist view that this is the recording of millions of years of development of life over time, as opposed to a catastrophic deposition over a year's time. The book, The Genesis Flood, built on Steno's understanding and expressed this view in terms of the modern understanding of geology and all, explaining what we know about geology in terms of the Genesis flood. And again, a lot of people will say, this is nuts. This doesn't fit what we see at all. But notice the statement by John C. McCampbell, who wrote the foreword to this book. He is an atheistic evolutionary geologist and head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southeastern Louisiana, one of the finest geology schools in the country. He says in the foreword to the book that the facts of geology do fit this interpretation. If somebody says they don't, you'll have to argue with John C. McCampbell, who's one of the leading authorities. They do, and he believes the other side, but the fact says they built a very strong case for this interpretation, and furthermore, a very serious to the evolutionary view. Now, he didn't say their facts fit and ours don't, but that's not far from, I mean, if you condense it down, that's not far from what he's really having to admit here. And I think that's absolutely correct. But we're told, you look at the fossil record and you see animals that are segregated. You see what is comprising the Cambrian layer, and then different animals are over here in the Ordovician layer, and others in the Silurian layer, so that you can identify these as Cambrian because they fit with that group. And everything up, which I don't think is the case at all. By the way, how many of you have ever seen a universal flood? Nobody here? There's a lot about that we don't know, and we can say, all right, we've seen local floods, it's just bigger. And that's not quite the way it works. Water flowing increases just in a mind-boggling way, its force and its transport power when you increase the speed. You increase the speed of the water, how much more stuff can it carry? You increase its carrying and eroding capacity by a factor of 12 when you double the speed. Now, that's just a simple fact that lets you know that yeah, we see local floods, but a universal flood is just beyond our capacity to imagine, I think. But let's think for a moment about some of the implications here of the segregation of the critters. Some animals segregated here, other animals in a different place segregated that go together, and other animals here. And I think when you look at the way things are distributed in the world today, the ecosystems, that's pretty typical of what you find, some lower than others, the bottom of the ocean. Some live higher, and you don't find everything mixed together. Even of the vertebrates, bears and lions today may in the past have lived, but they're different. Not because they're millions of years apart, and certainly things that live at the bottom of the ocean, things that live on the plains. And I think if you buried the world, you would see those kinds of ecological segregations preserved. And I think that's what's seen in the fossil record. This is fairly representative of what you see. Now, that's not the way it's represented. It's represented more like this, but this is arranged together, not necessarily the way you find it. Though typically, I will acknowledge that things lived at the bottom of the ocean are going to be buried lower. Things that lived higher would typically be found higher, so there's a general order, but it's certainly not this ordered sequence that you see in the textbooks. What we're looking at here is a skewed, based on the fact that you see virtually no marine invertebrates, which is virtually all of it. It is arranged, it is a conceptual correlation, but how do you test this? Maybe, circular logic is not always bad in science if you understand that that's what you're doing, and if you're not using it as proof. That's what you do when you form a hypothesis, an educated guess, and say, all right, now let's test this and see if it works. You begin with a conclusion, but you don't begin with that conclusion, illustrate it, and say, see there, I proved it. You use that as a comparison against the real world, test it and see if it fits the facts. And that's really the proper use of the column. Here is an illustration of the model. Now, let's test it by looking at the evidence, and it's kind of hard to break into sometimes. But let's allow the evolutionists to describe how that ought to be done. Topsy-turvy fossils is the way to do it. According to S.M. Stanley, this would disprove evolution. Any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory. It's supposed to be up here, you find it down here. Or it's supposed to be down here, you find it up here. This would disprove, though that's not quite the way it works in practice. But a topsy-turvy fossil is something supposed to be down, found up. Well, yes, but we do that all the time. There are lots of things that are, quote, living fossils. Things that have supposed to have been extinct for hundreds of millions of years in the ocean, something. And that happens so many times, and that's exactly what he's calling for, that they just kind of sweep that under the rug and say, well, no, yeah, that happens, but that's not what we're looking for. Really, what they want to find is the opposite. But notice the statement here by Niles Eldredge talking about living fossils. He's curator of the American Museum of Natural History. There seems to have been almost no change in any part we can compare between the living organism and its fossilized progenitors in the remote geological past. We have not completely solved the riddle of living fossils, things at the bottom that we find still alive. One clear example would be the horseshoe crab, as it's called, crab in quotes. It's closer to the spiders, I think. But we see the fossils from way back, and we see the living critters running around. this is exactly the kind of thing that he was calling for. This you find 424 million years ago, according to their interpretation, which of course I don't accept, but this is their view. That's topsy-turvy. It's still around today. It's still alive. It's still just like what you find in the fossil record. Notice the statement by Keith Thompson, who's president of the Academy of Natural Sciences, in his book Living Fossils, referring to the horseshoe crab. The first members of the group appeared some 424 million years ago in the Silurian and looked quite like modern forms. The last fossil became extinct about 50 million years ago. Well, of course, fossils don't become extinct, but we know what he's talking about here. 50 million years, according to them, and you got no fossils, but they're still alive. Now, this doesn't quite fit the picture that's predicted. One of the more famous living fossils would be the coelacanth, the fish that lived with the dinosaurs, described in the book Living Fossil by Keith Thompson, president of the Academy of Natural Sciences. He says, off the coast of southern Africa in the winter of 1938, a fishing boat called the Nyreen dragged from the Indian Ocean near the Chaluma River a fish thought to be extinct for over 70 million years. Now, that's beyond our capacity to really grasp as a time period, but that's all. You ought to find a fossil in there somewhere if the thing's still running around or swimming around. The fish was a coelacanth, an animal that thrived concurrently with the dinosaurs, but no fossils for 70 million years. The fish some 425 million years ago in the Silurian looked quite like modern forms. We have no fossils of coelacanths younger than the late Cretaceous. The late Cretaceous is the last time we saw the dinosaurs. Same evidence for extinction of the coelacanth that we have for extinction of the dinosaurs. You find them up to the late Cretaceous, then they're gone. Same thing with the coelacanth. Except with the coelacanths, they're out swimming around in the ocean, and we see them all over the place. Caught over 600 of them now since they were first discovered. Well, that's a problem. That doesn't quite fit what's predicted, does it? Things that are supposed to be down are found up. That's topsy-turvy. But there's so many of those, they say, well, yeah, we hadn't solved that riddle. That's a problem. But really what you need to find is the opposite. Things that are up, you need to find down. That would be better evidence, they say, though I can kind of see some of the reason for that, but the logic is certainly very similar to the opposite. These we'll call turvy fossils. The others would be topsy fossils. Things supposed to be up that are found down. Notice their proposition regarding such a find. Richard Dawkins of Oxford, writing in The Blind Watchmaker, and from that title you understand where he's coming from. He believes in the blind watchmaker. We should be very surprised, for example, to find fossil humans appearing in the record before mammals are supposed to have evolved. If a single well-verified mammal skull were to turn up in 500 million-year-old rocks, here's what's supposed to be up, found down, our whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. This is really a test that he will acknowledge is a test. Now, he has ulterior motives here for acknowledging it so frankly. Some had objected that evolution is not testable. And as we pointed out in the criteria or testable to be science. He says, well, yes, it is testable, and here's the test. So he sticks his neck out. Much of the argumentation for evolution, I think, is not testable. Like survival of the fittest. How do you define the fittest? It's those that survive, isn't it? So it's the survival of those that survive. How do you test that? That's a tautology. But he's right. This is a test, and it should falsify. And if you find this, it would. Well, we've done that a number of times. For example, here near LaSalle, Utah, we find perfectly modern human skeletons that are found 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone, a layer that's famous for its dinosaurs. It's the layer that is one of the layers that is found at Dinosaur National Monument, very famous for its dinosaurs. And here now 10 individuals have been found. And so we look back at Dawkins' statement, and this phrase, well verified, gets to be the key phrase here. Yes, it would utterly destroy if it were well verified, but if you find humans down there with them, we're not going to verify it. That's what it comes out to. Now, if you think that's cynical, let's just see how well verified this find is. We went back to the site where these were found. This is an open pit copper mine, and we spent a good bit of time there investigating. Where the backhoe is, very close to that, over to the left, is where the first two skeletons were found, 50 feet down. Here's a side profile of that section, and this was the mining operation that began back in the 30s, mining copper. They hit hard layers, so hard it was tearing up their bulldozers, and so they had to stop. And then began again in the 70s when they had better equipment. And then got down to the layer where we have found the skeletons, now 10 individuals. We have 5 males, 4 females, and an infant. The road cut over on the extreme left was cut in 1930. Right after that, they began the mining operation of the 30s. This is the fellow who actually drove the bulldozer in the 70s. His father did in the 30s. And he pointed out to us exactly where he uncovered those first 2 skeletons. He said there were no breaks in the rock. This was 50 feet down. This is the way it looked just months before the discovery was made. This was the way it was when they began in the 70s to take this down to the layer where they were found. 150 feet back from the road cut, which was cut in 1930. This is an aerial photograph of the area just shortly after the road cut. This is the area of the mine, and here we see the road cut that was done in 1930. We see the excavation of the 30s. This was the area that was excavated in the 70s, there in front of the road. Before 1930, it looked like this, and we can demonstrate that from the aerial photographs. It's 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone in undisturbed, under very hard rock. I think that's about as well verified as you can get it. Well, somebody must have buried them real deep. I've heard them say that with this rock that was tearing up the bulldozers. Maybe they fell down a crack. Maybe they crawled back in a cave and it collapsed on them. Of course, there are no broken bones. Males, females, infants, no, I don't think so. These were not intrusionally buried, which is the typical objection that's given. Here we see some of those skeletons embedded in this rock. The lower right-hand corner, we see the pelvis area. Extending up toward the upper center is the femur, the thigh bone, and then the knee at the top and back down to the foot over toward the lower left. Here's the pelvis, the knee, the foot. There is a second leg back here. This one is together, as in life. Articulated is the fancy term for it. Of the other 10, they're not. They're just washed into place, is what it looks like this one. These 2 bones may appear to belong together. They really don't. They're just washed together like the 2 in the foreground. But parts of at least 10 individuals have been found. This is one of the bones that we excavated. It had been out of the rock about 5 minutes, washed it off with a canteen, and it's this brilliant green. It's replaced with malachite, which doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't take millions of years, but shows it certainly is not a recent burial. If it's older than 1930, though, there's a very serious problem, obviously. This is one of those turvy fossils. Exactly the sort of thing that he's asking about. He says, if we find this well verified, what's the implication? Our whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. Well, you can decide yourself if it's well verified. They're never going to acknowledge that because of the implications. He continues, ironically, it's also the reason why creationists are so keen on the fake human footprints which were carved during the Depression to fool tourists in the dinosaur beds of Texas. So he's heard about the footprints down at Glen Rose, Texas, all the way from Oxford. And sitting behind his desk at Oxford, he knows that they're carved. He hasn't investigated or been there to see. But the reason, he says, they're so interested is this would utterly destroy. He's acknowledging this. And so, yes, they're interested in that, but they're fake and they're carved. Well, let's check that out and see if that's the case. Of course, this affords somewhat of an advantage. Bones are better than tracks. Well, bones can fall down cracks, and you can erode them and redeposit them, but you can't do that with footprints, can you? They cannot possibly be intrusionally buried, and so you eliminate that objection when you're dealing with the footprints. At the Paluxy River, Dinosaur Valley State Park, about 60 miles south and a little bit west of Dallas, you see the Paluxy River going through the park, and they're just beautiful dinosaur tracks all over the place there, literally hundreds of them. These were exposed in the late 30s, early 40s by Roland T. Byrd of the American Museum of Natural History. And we see the big sauropod tracks, like almost elephant tracks with toes at the end, and then the three-toed tracks of the Tyrannosaurus type. Some of them uniquely are raised three-dimensionally, and that caused us to scratch our head a little bit. What would cause that? And apparently the dinosaur stepped, left the depression, which then was filled in with material that washed over it, and then it all hardened to rock, much like concrete, I think. You would have to do it rapidly in order to preserve the tracks. But the material that washed in and filled in became harder, so when it's later exposed and erosion affects it, it erodes away the matrix around it, and the center hard part is what begins to stick out. Now that becomes significant and will when we look at other tracks. But we also find tracks that look like this. Well, this is what Dawkins is talking about. He knows that's just too good to be true. It's carved, has to be, and I'll acknowledge I was somewhat intimidated by that. That just looks too good to be true. Maybe we can look around and find some that don't look quite so good, which we were able to do. Here we see one in the lower right-hand corner, not real clear in this photograph, beside a dinosaur track, a trail of dinosaur tracks. This one was identified by the Dallas Crime Lab as a human footprint by the aspect ratios and various features of the foot. This was one just a little ways from that area. In the close-up, you can see the obvious configuration to the human foot. But you do find strange-looking things in rocks that just happen to look like feet or other things. What you really need is a sequence, a right-left sequence, to know that we're dealing with real tracks here. This one, sometimes they'll say, well, this is just erosion. But look at the mud push-up in front of the toes here. Erosion doesn't leave those kind of marks, do they? That would certainly argue against it. If you find bones, they're intrusionally buried. If you find tracks, they're either eroded or they're carved. A whole new set of objections, so you have to just shift what you're trying to answer. Here, now that doesn't appear to be erosion. Stan Taylor decided to test the idea that they were carved when he found two tracks coming out from under the riverbank. He said, okay, let's go back up under the riverbank and see if this trail continues. And so he began to remove these layers to follow the trail back up under the bank, about 6 feet of alternating layers of clay and limestone, clay and limestone, and clay and limestone. What happens if that trail continues back up under the layers? What would that say about the hypothesis that they're carved? That'd pretty well rip it, wouldn't it? Well, he found the sequence of 9 tracks, 7 more, continuing back up under the riverbank. We had to sandbag here to keep the river from covering them up. Some of them are very clear and very plain. Looking at a close-up here, again, you can see that mud push-up around it, typical to what would happen when you put a foot in the mud, which, of course, has to harden like concrete quickly to preserve these tracks, but very human-like shape. And that was very persuasive, and people got pretty upset about this. And finally, there was an explanation proposed by Glenn Kuban, who is a computer programmer from Cleveland, some expert, not an expert in paleontology, but he got Humanist of the Year for coming up with this idea that these are just eroded dinosaur tracks. And we see the duck-type print, the upper left-hand corner, that erodes to look kind of like the one beside it. But the elongated track erodes, he says, to look finally like the one in the lower right-hand corner over here. And that looks kind of human-like, and it's just an erosion of a track that looks like this. Well, there are several problems with that. In the first place, the infill material is harder, and it becomes raised with erosion. It gets sharper and clearer with erosion. It doesn't erode to look like a human footprint. These are extremely sharp and extremely crisp, and they will become more so with erosion. Here is a side view that shows that three-dimensional contour. What happens with more erosion? It's getting sharper and clearer. It's not beginning to look like a human footprint, is it? And casts were made of some of these prints when they were first uncovered. This is one made by Stan Taylor. Is that an eroded dinosaur track? Just too much detail there, isn't there? That just doesn't fly. But it shows how desperate they are to come up with an explanation, to give Humanist of the Year to a fellow who comes up with that idea. You put a human foot in that cast and the configuration is perfect. This is probably the one that really persuaded me. It's in the center of the trail. Actually, we had extended it now to a total of 14. And you have to look at this one a little bit in order to see what's here. This is the dinosaur track. It's almost 25 inches long, but look what's stepped in the middle of it. You see all 5 toes, an instep and heel, right in the middle of the dinosaur track. Now, if it's any clearer, then it was carved. If it's any less clear, then it's erosion. Actually, we've had them say both about this, so that means it's just right. And right in the middle of the dinosaur track. It so disturbed one of the evolutionists that he beat it up, and it looked like this when he got through with it. That was the day after I made the first national presentation at a science convention in Tennessee. But we have excellent cast stereo photographs. It's certainly well documented. Further up the trail, several tracks up this trail of 15, we see this track. In the foreground, the anterior portion, we see the 3 toes of the dinosaur track, mostly filled in. But look at what's depressed back there toward the rear of it. Now, there's 134 dinosaur tracks on this platform, but the trail of 14 tracks is beside and across and within. Looking at a side view of that same track, we see that anterior portion almost flush, the 3 toes up here filled in, but then the depressed part is pretty obviously like a human foot, especially when you put one in it. Now, one way to make sure we're dealing with a real set of tracks here is to see if we've got a right-left sequence. Right, left, right, that would be impressive. All right, this one is a right. Directly ahead of it is a left. And that's what we see for 14. Right, left, right, left. That's pretty impressive. And of course, that's the way you do science. Beside this one, it didn't show up the first time we saw it, but you can see over here in the upper right-hand, something going on up here. It's in the bottom of the river. We have to sandbag, wait till the late fall, usually when the water's lowest, to sandbag and then see them again. The next year, we saw that this, what was beside it, that we're looking at here, was a dinosaur track, 25 inches long, but here is that same track right beside, not across, within, as with some of them, but beside the dinosaur track. When we analyzed the whole sequence, and this is the whole picture that you're looking at here with a Brontosaurus trail going across it at about 30 degrees. We found 14 tracks. They're numbered here in terms of what shows up as the water goes down. +1 is the highest, and then in each direction we've numbered them. All of them have at least the general human shape. Now, if you just watch what kind of footprints you make with bare feet in the mud, they're not all perfect. They're just all kinds of shapes if you're not just working hard to make them. And even when you are, it doesn't always turn out perfectly. The length is extremely consistent, right at 11.5 inches. Toes are seen in 7 of the 14 tracks. If you're familiar with Mary Leakey's tracks that she found over in Africa in the volcanic ash, none of them have individual toes. Well, you can see the great toe in a few of them, but the individual toes cannot be seen. Here you can see them in 7, and of course we've shown you the most dramatic ones. The rights and lefts can be distinguished in 12 of the 14. Two of them are just kind of oblong shapes that you can see. And of course, as the evolutionist shows you what's here, guess which ones he shows you? those two. And they're all consistent. You don't have rights where the lefts are supposed to be or vice versa. It's consistent from one end to the other. Dawkins is sitting behind his desk saying they have to be carved. And somebody else is getting out doing the science. Can you tell which one is doing science? I think it ought to be obvious. Now, it's true that when you look at abstract forms, sometimes they wind up looking accidentally, like here the bird in the clouds. Or you look at the side of the mountain, you see the old man in the mountain. But how can you tell whether or not this was carved? Well, if you see 4 old men in the mountain, you got a pretty good idea this was carved, right? When you see a sequence of 14 in a right-left, this is not erosion. We know that, like the old man in the mountain. This is distinguished by the right-left sequence of 14 and the clear, all 5 toes, instep, and heel in some of these tracks. I think that makes it very good science, well verified. Well, this typical answer is you got to have more evidence when they can't answer. Well, let's find some. Well, we began to work, and going down the trail the other way, we found the longest consecutive trail of dinosaurs on the American continent. 154 consecutive dinosaur tracks, over 500 feet of them. And that's quite an accomplishment. It's now known as the Turnage Patent Trail. Turnage several years ago found the first 4, and then we excavated the rest of them. There's only one longer trail in the world, over in Turkmenistan. We know what dinosaur tracks look like. These are good dinosaur tracks. They're some of the best in the world. Just spectacular. No way to confuse this. But they're not like what we see just up ahead. This is the trail of the human tracks that is just dramatically different. Well, you still need some more evidence. Well, we continued to work, and about 50 yards ahead of this trail, we found another trail. This is a platform with still about 100 dinosaur tracks that can be seen, but going right down the middle of it is another trail, this time 15 in a right-left pattern, about 10 inches long instead of 11 and a half. Looking at a close-up here, we see those raised dinosaur tracks here, especially the one on the left and its mate on the right, slightly raised, but look what stepped in the back of the one on the right and made the mud push-up around it. While the dinosaur tracks are slightly raised, this depression is dramatically different. Looking at a close-up of the one on the right, here we see the slightly raised dinosaur track matching its mate on the left, but wow, that's about as good as you could imagine. You can even count the joints in the knuckles and the toes. And it's in a sequence of 15 in a right-left pattern. Many of those are also clear. This is the clearest one. More evidence? Well, it gets to the point where, this is a pretty good stack. If you're honest, you need to begin to acknowledge this. And we present this on college campuses across the country. And I really enjoy it. Now, what can you say? We were presenting this to a group of senior geologists at the University in Tennessee. They all turned around, looked at the head of the department. What are you going to say about this? He said, well, we don't know that there weren't dinosaurs back there with human feet. I'm telling you the truth. And they kind of snickered, and I said, well, I guess that's true. We don't know that there were. We also don't know there weren't humans back there with dinosaur feet. Wouldn't that make about as much sense? Isn't it more reasonable to say these things that look like human feet were made by humans? These things look like dinosaur feet made by dinosaurs? No, I wouldn't say that. I said, well, if they were human tracks, would they look any different? And he got up and left. And we convinced a good percentage of that senior geology class. In fact, baptized 2 of them just a few weeks later. This is persuasive evidence, and I've presented enough time on college campuses to know they don't have answers. Dr. Chuck Finsley was curator of the Dallas Museum of Natural History. He came down to Glen Rose to look at these several times. He wanted to display some of the dinosaurs that we had excavated. And we were mean to him. We made him look at the tracks, and tell us what he thought. And he'd kind of squirm and say, well, I'll have to think about that. And about the third time down, he said, Dr. Patton, I've come up with an explanation. I can tell you what these things that look like human tracks really are. He said, these were made by aliens. And he was dead serious. Still is. That's what he thinks. That's his curator of the Dallas Museum of Natural History for 30 years. And this is the best he can come up with. And that's the kind of thing that you find. These are the perfect turvy fossils because they can't be intrusionally buried. You can't do that with tracks. We've eliminated the possibility of erosion because they're excavated from under the overburden. And the fact that you have the right-left pattern. And likewise, the fact that they're carved, excavated from under the overburden. They're in situ in place, they're not carved, and they're not erosion. I think that's well verified. Response reminded me of the Far Side cartoon. Here's Professor Farrington and his controversial theory that dinosaurs were actually the discarded chicken bones of giant alien picnickers, which I think is pretty far out. But if you want to think that, I guess you can. If you want to draw a cartoon, I think this one may present the picture a little bit more accurately. We get a little lighthearted about it sometimes, but you can tell we're having fun and enjoying ourselves just following the... All right, we're going to take a break at this point and see if some of you have some questions. Yes, sir.
Were the stride patterns consistent with human strides today?
Absolutely. Thank you. You want to ask that?
Were the strides pattern consistent with human strides today?
The average distance between the tracks is just over 2 feet. It will vary. You can see that in that first trail, called the Taylor Trail, Stan Taylor that excavated it, they start out at a fairly normal pace, slow down, and he stopped. And that really clear one that I said really persuaded me, that got beat up, is a standing track. The next one actually overlaps. There's no distance between the two. And then from that point, they begin to spread out and get further apart so that at the end of the trail, he's running, and they're pretty good distance apart, but it's a running stride. So you can tell what's going on, but you can walk in those tracks and repeat that sequence easily. Now, at 11 and a half inches, if his proportions are average, he would have been 6'4". Pretty good sized fellow. Of course, lots of short people got big feet, so we don't know for sure, but that would be the prediction. But yes, they fit, and you can walk in that stride without any problem. I can. I'm not that tall.
I noticed that you didn't include the cross-section of that footprint that was too good to be true. Is there a reason for that?
That's coming. That's next. Yes, in the back.
It seems as if there would be a significant difference in the depth, say, of a human footprint versus a dinosaur, weight-wise to size ratio.
You would think that initially. The difference, though, is in the amount of resistance that you have, and that varies if you're making it like in wet concrete. Sometimes you got gushy concrete and you sink way down. Sometimes you got almost hard concrete, and so just how hard was it when they stepped would determine. Plus, the dinosaur has a broader surface to support that, so there are half a dozen things that are variables, and you can find most anything. But yes, you find more dinosaur tracks than human tracks in the area, I think, basically because when you weigh 10 tons, you make better tracks. You make real good ones. But if you ever find them clearly together, you know they're not millions of years apart. Good question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What happened to the fella that destroyed the track? That doesn't, well, it's totally dishonest, and I just can't imagine that being done.
He's the fellow that got Humanist of the Year, and we had just shot him down. We made that presentation on Saturday, I flew out that night to be back Sunday morning in Dallas. He was in the hotel room of several of the creationists who stayed there till 2 or 3 o'clock Sunday morning, just bugging. He was raving, I was told. But was on an airplane at 8:30 Sunday morning, flew to Dallas, was in the river that afternoon. The property owners called us and said, Mr. Kuman is out in the river with this iron pole with a friend of his. Can you come out here and see what he's doing? And I couldn't at the time. I was preaching that day. It was actually Wednesday before we could get out there, but when we did, we could see the fresh bash marks where he had some. I didn't see him do it, but I'm just telling you what we know. I was called, told he was out there with the iron bar, came out there and saw the bash marks. So those are facts. We didn't see him do it. The ones who did see him out there were not willing to testify. Their son is a county commissioner. He doesn't like to get in anything controversial, and he ordered them to keep quiet about it. And they have since deceased. But they told me they called us and told us and would talk to us freely about it. What happened to him? Well, if you could prove it, he'd go to jail. And I'd love to prove it.
Are those tracks that you showed us there in that picture, are they protected now in any way? Or are they still on, are they on?
Mud and about 4 feet of water over them right now, and from time to time they're exposed. They're in the middle of a river which belongs to the state of Texas. Now, the state of Texas is buying up the property around it. The landowners that have deceased willed that to their children. They're not nearly as cooperative, and so we don't have free access as we did, though we do have some limited access, though it's underwater most of the time. The state did buy the property across the river, and so they're trying to keep us away from it. The state park manager has ordered me to stay away. He says, if you come back down there, I'll have you put in jail, and he's tried, believe it or not. I mean, I'm just down there investigating as a scientist with permits. He got his PhD for studying those tracks, and he doesn't want anybody messing up what he had to say about them. And he actually sent down an officer to have me arrested. This is a battle, and they don't always play fair, and of course we're used to that. Yes. Of course, the fact that I found the longest consecutive trail on the American continent right in under his chin just infuriated him.
What do the schools of geology around the country teach about Glen Rose?
Just what Dawkins says. They're all carved. It's fake. And the kids say, okay. Some of them will say, why don't you go onto the website, bible.ca/tracks, and look at the tracks and look at the evidence and see for yourself. And we had 4,100,000 on the website last month in February. So the word's getting out.
Where does the trail end and where does it begin of those tracks you're talking about?
The human tracks, you saw the 15. I think there are probably a couple more. They're faint. They're questionable. I don't include them, but I think I can make a case for them. At the end of the trail, you can see the dinosaur that he was associated with for several tracks going this way, and he's going this way. But there are dinosaur tracks, of course, all over that area. But these two human trails, one for 14, one for 15, end virtually at that point. Yes.
Okay. Was that the only one, those two tracks? One you said like it was 11 and a half and the other one was a 10. Anywhere in those other areas, did you find footprints, and were they basically the same size? So maybe it's like this, could be the same type, or maybe there was more than just the two different.
There's another sequence about 50 feet from the Taylor Trail, over across on the other side of the river, that was also destroyed. I don't have time to show you all of the evidence, but there were 3 tracks that I featured in that presentation at the Tennessee meeting, science meeting, and those 3 were the 3 that were bashed. At that time, they were under at least 3 feet of muddy water, and Glenn Kuban and myself and maybe one other fellow, the only ones in the world, could have found those 3. So, but the ones I featured were the ones that got bashed.
That's what I mean is, could you tell, were they different sizes, or were they like
The 2
together?
trails are different. One averages 11 and a half, the other is 10. The one, the short sequence was about 9 and a half, so it could have been the 10-inch one, likely a different individual. There are also some small tracks that are not necessarily in sequence, but we found about 4 of them that are pretty clear, which would be a child's track. So, there's more than one individual there. All right, our time is up for questions. Why don't we take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll look at some more, I think, very exciting information in the second half.